It was Scottish economist and philosopher Thomas Carlyle who notoriously described economics as the dismal science. Mr. Carlyle died in 1881, so he never had the chance to meet our lead panelist today, Sean Snaith. He specializes in making economics entertaining as well as informative. If Carlyle knew Sean, he would have taken back his statement. If Carlyle had been a newspaper reporter, he might have felt obliged to publish a correction. And we've got 4 other panelists today, a diverse and outspoken group, to talk about this very important topic. If you read the Orlando Sentinel on Sunday, August 31st, and I hope you did, the lead story that day, the day before Labor Day, featured the following headline: Florida's wage gap widening. The story spotlighted the findings in a recent report from Florida International University. Among those findings, according to reporter Bill Gibson, wages are just inching up for most Florida workers, except for those at the upper end of the income scale. The gap between highly paid workers and low-wage workers is turning into a chasm. And this most striking sentence, taken straight from the report, a growing gap between high and low-wage earners means that Florida's workers are living in increasingly separate worlds. The statistics in this report probably won't come as a surprise to those of you who follow the news. You've been reading accounts like this one for years. In fact, the incomes of higher paid workers have been increasing faster than other workers for decades, according to many economists. 3 years ago, the concentration of wealth inspired the Occupy movement, whose protesters targeted the richest 1% of Americans. It's ironic that data from the Census Bureau indicate that average incomes for low and middle income Americans have actually fallen since 2008, when President Obama was elected and the Democratic Senate majority reached its high water mark. And just to add to the bad news, the Sentinel reported just yesterday that employers have been cutting employee benefits since 2008. Critics on the right point to statistics like these as evidence that progressive policies or leadership intended to promote economic equality actually hurts the folks they're supposed to help. And critics on the left counter that the American economy is still recovering from the crash that happened under conservative leadership. There's also a divide between liberals and conservatives over how to deal with the income gap. Should governments do more to close the gap through, for example, raising the minimum wage, or changing tax policy, or spending more on education and job training, or strengthening the social safety net? Or should governments get out of the way and cut taxes and regulations on employers to make it easier and cheaper for them to create jobs? These are some of the angles we'll be exploring over the next 90 minutes in today's forum, and we'll continue to cover the issue in the Orlando Sentinel, in print, and through our digital platform for desktop and mobile devices. As you may be aware, we've just remastered that platform. Our coverage will be overseen by the Sentinel's editor, Avido Kahaifa, and associate editor, John Cutter, who is here today. Once again, we're live streaming today's forum on our website, orlandosentinel.com. We also hope to have video clips from today's event on our website by the end of the day. I'm going to invite our panelists up to the stage now and introduce them. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to do true justice to the many credentials and accomplishments of our panelists in my brief introductions. Consider these the Twitter versions. Each of them will have a couple of minutes to make a few remarks after my introduction, then we will get right into the conversation. As always, if panel members can be reasonably brief in their opening statements and answers to questions, we'll cover more ground. And we'll wrap up by 1:30 so you can get on with the rest of your day. Our first panelist, Dr. Sean Snaith, is the director of the University of Central Florida's Institute for Economic Competitiveness. He's built a national reputation as a business and economic forecaster. If you follow economic issues, you might have read his quotations in publications like USA Today, the New York Times, and the Orlando Sentinel, or you might have watched him on CNBC or the Fox Business Network. Sean is also a member of national economic forecasting panels for the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, and CNNmoney.com, among others. And you know what they say about forecasting. God invented economists to make meteorologists look good. Sean has his master's and PhD in economics from Pennsylvania State University, and his previous teaching gigs have included one at the American University in Cairo. Today we're continuing our tradition at these forums of sharing an unexpected fact about each of our panelists. Here's something I'm quite confident you didn't know about Sean. He once worked in a department store as a fragrance model. And he says to this day he can still pick out the smell of Christian Dior's Poison fragrance in a crowded room. Welcome, Sean. You'd like to?
I'll give the talk?
Yeah.
Give the intro? Okay, I thought we were going to go through the panel. Well, thanks, Paul, for that introduction. I don't sense any poison in the room right now. I'll let you know if that changes. Yeah, I think inequality has sort of come to the forefront of our national discussion and awareness right now. Some of it was a result of some comments that Alan Kruger made regarding what's known as the Gatsby curve. And I think that income inequality certainly has gotten wider. The question is that in and of itself a bad thing? Why is this gap growing? And I think there are a variety of reasons. And I think Paul touched on a couple of things. This economic recovery has been historically weak. And the nature of it and the policies that have been implemented during and in the wake of the Great Recession, I think have actually worsened income inequality in the U.S. You know, since the low point of the financial crisis, U.S. households have regained $27 trillion in financial asset wealth. So $27 trillion. Now, where is the bulk of that money going to? Who benefits the most from this tremendous bull market in the stock and bond market? Well, it's not going to be the lower end of the income distribution. It's going to be that upper 1%. And I think that in and of itself has really stretched this inequality, growth in the wealth of that upper 1%. Now, in and of itself, is income inequality a bad thing? I think more importantly is how is mobility, has mobility been affected? Is someone born into the lower quartile of income distribution able to progress up that economic ladder over time? To me, that's a more important question, not whether Steve Jobs is a billionaire because of the iPhone. But can a child today that's born in an impoverished situation have an opportunity to climb up and ascend that socioeconomic ladder?
Thanks, Sean. Our next panelist, Stephanie Porta, is co-founder and executive director of Organize Now and the Florida Institute for Reform and Empowerment, two groups focused on the needs of Florida's low and moderate income communities. Over the past decade, she has worked on a wide range of goals, from expanding healthcare to fighting foreclosures. She played a leading role in the successful statewide campaign in 2004 to win voter approval to raise Florida's minimum wage. More recently, she led the campaign in Orange County for a ballot initiative to guarantee sick time for employees. And last month, voters overwhelmingly endorsed that guarantee in a non-binding referendum. She's the daughter of Katie Porta, a well-known champion for people with disabilities and the Sentinel's 2013 Central Floridian of the Year. And you probably didn't know that Stephanie is a proud member of the Ruckus, Orlando City Soccer's biggest fan club. So welcome, Stephanie, and go Lions.
Thank you. I'm not quite as good at the numbers as you are, but I've taken some notes. So I appreciate being invited here because I care a lot about the widening income gap. Nobody working full-time or multiple jobs should be living in poverty. Parents shouldn't have to choose between putting dinner on the table and paying the rent. Ensuring families earn fair wages will benefit the entire economy. A stable middle class will bring more business into local communities and help create more long-term jobs. Because when you're struggling to get by each month, you're not putting money back into the economy. This is why I support the fight to raise the minimum wage. It's the first step we can take to give hardworking families a fair shot. Since 1978, CEO income has risen 127 times faster than the average worker's pay. Can anyone guess how much the average CEO makes compared to his or employees today? Guess? Anybody? 200 times. CEOs make 200 times what their employees make, and fast food CEOs make more than 1,000 times what their employees make. Inequality has been pushing the middle class further and further into poverty and debt. I'm sure we have a lot of different feelings on all of this, but I look forward to an incredibly spirited debate. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie. Our next panelist, Jack Chambless, is a professor of economics, an author, and a speaker. Since 1991, he has taught at Valencia College not only micro and macro economics, but also special topics in his field, including oil, economics, and terrorism. He writes a regular column for the Sentinel and has had his work published in other major publications, including the Wall Street Journal. He's been interviewed on national TV and radio broadcasts by Fox, CNBC, the BBC, and NPR, among other acronyms. He's a policy advisor for the Heartland Institute, a think tank based in Chicago, and a senior fellow with the James Madison Institute, which is based in Tallahassee. And for the unexpected about Jack, he is a native of Germany, and his uncle, several generations removed, is the German writer Goethe. Willkommen, Jack.
Well, first I want to thank the Orlando Sentinel for sponsoring this important event and for all of you for taking your time out of your busy schedules to be here. For those of us who care about income and income inequality and opportunity and our right to pursue happiness must come to grips with the reality that income inequality in the United States of America comes from both natural and unnatural forces. The natural forces are quite clear. Oprah Winfrey makes more money than I do because she has pleased more people than I can. 40 students will show up by force in my classes, and millions watch her voluntarily. Tom Brady pleases more people as a quarterback for the New England Patriots than I do. And the Google guys, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, please a lot more people than I do. So they are able to claim a greater share of the income of this country because in our free market economy, so to speak, they are able to prove that they are worth more to their fellow man and do more for their fellow man than I do. I make more money than most of my students because so far I've been able to please more people than they have, and many of my students make more money than their colleagues who dropped out of high school. So to an extent that we reward differences in our country based on ability, whether it's athletic or looks or intelligence or effort, income inequality, to an extent, is going to naturally occur. The laws of supply and demand guarantee it, and the laws of supply and demand cannot be repealed by busybody Republicans or Democrats. To the extent that income inequality comes from unnatural sources, I would first like to share with you a quote from the Supreme Court. In 1795, the United States Supreme Court declared, "The right of acquiring and possessing property and having it protected is one of the natural, inherent, and inalienable rights of man. No man would become a member of a community in which he could not enjoy the fruits of his honest labor and industry. The preservation of property, then, is the primary object of the social compact." Much of the income inequality discussion has dovetailed towards the idea of taking from those like Oprah Winfrey and spreading it around to everyone else, ignoring the unnatural barriers to income growth that have been created by government. Florida ranks 4th in the degree to which we make occupational licensing difficult for poor people struggling to come out of poverty. Poor people including the 30-plus barbers who were arrested because they did not have a license to cut people's hair, guaranteeing they would be even poorer when the government got through with them. Our uncompetitive tax code, our failing public schools, all of these combine to keep people from growing up the income ladder. And if we really care about the poor, we need to do more to raise their standard of living by getting out of their way rather than punishing those who have been successful and reallocating it to them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. Our next panelist, Tico Perez, is a shareholder with the Gunster Law Firm in Orlando with a practice focused on government affairs and public policy. But you probably know him better for his longtime leadership in civic organizations. The many credits on his resume include past president of the Greater Orlando Chamber of Commerce and former member of the Board of Governors for the State University system in Florida. Currently, he's a national commissioner for the Boy Scouts of America. He's also a regular commentator on politics on TV and radio. Our unexpected bit of information about Tico is that his brother was the principal in the Joffrey Ballet back in the 70s and 80s and ultimately went on to star in dozens of Broadway shows. Bravo, Tico, and welcome.
Thank you, Paul. And I want to point out, he might have worn a tutu, I wore a 4-4, just so you know. But it is a pleasure to be here today to talk about these issues. They're important. And I do say issues for a reason. I think that the theme, income inequality, is a simplistic way to address two largely unrelated problems and to juxtapose them with political speak for political purposes. When we take these two together and we make it one issue, it becomes almost impossible to solve. I don't believe there is one problem we can call income inequality. I do think the concentration of wealth at the top 1% presents challenges for our economy, and the causes of this concentration are historical, and they've accelerated of late, largely due to the recent political and fiscal policies. There's also a problem at the bottom of the income stream. There is no doubt that we have a growing number of people who are stuck in poverty, living on the margins, with little hope of changing their positions or their social mobility. However, we do make a grave mistake if we tie these two problems together, at least if we're looking for solutions rather than scoring political points. Only those who believe in a zero-sum game really believe that the growing affluence of the rich causes the continued immobility of the poor. That argument might make good politics, but it makes it much harder to manage and resolve the challenges we face. If you believe that the problem is income inequality, the people at the bottom aren't paid enough and can't live on a minimum wage, and the answer is simple: raise the minimum wage. But it's not that simple. As I'm sure we'll discuss, raising the minimum wage is not the best answer. The real problem for the poor is not that they're making too little per hour, it's that they're working too few hours. In fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics said 51.5% of workers earning the minimum wage are only working 29 hours a week, or they're not working at all. The most recent labor participation rate was 62.8%, the lowest since 1978. And let me make a very clear point, that it is not because they don't want to work. It's because the jobs are not available because of the structural challenges we've created. So if we're going to have a real conversation today about these problems, then we've got to face a lot of educational, cultural, social, behavioral, economic, and political issues to get to the root of this conversation, because to lump all of these issues into one economic, political speak argument, frankly, is lazy, it's wrong, and it's going to polarize our conversation, and we'll never get to a solution.
Thanks, Tico. Our final panelist, Val Demings, is a familiar figure in Central Florida. She became the first woman to lead the Orlando Police Department in 2007 and retired from that post in 2011. During her time as chief, violent crime in the city fell 40%. Before she began her 27 years in the department, she was a social worker focused on foster care. She's the founder of Operation Positive Direction, a youth mentoring program, and she's been a leader in numerous other community organizations, including the Heart of Florida United Way. She's a native of Jacksonville, the youngest of 7 children. She's married to Orange County Sheriff Jerry Demings, and they have 3 sons. And what you might not have known about Val is that her favorite thing to do is ride her motorcycle, a red 2004 Harley-Davidson Road King Classic. Val learned how to ride in 2003 after she was named commander of the OPD division that oversees motorcycles. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Well, I want to first of all thank the Orlando Sentinel and all of you for this awesome opportunity to discuss this very important issue. I have already had to make some notes. I thought I wouldn't have to make any notes until we got well into the discussion, but I've already had to make some. Just one comment to Professor Chambless. The poor people that we're here to talk about, the working class, they aren't watching Oprah Winfrey because they're getting ready to go to their second job that they have to work. And they certainly cannot afford to purchase a ticket to see an NFL football game. So I do want to thank you so much for this opportunity. I think the best way to talk about income inequality for me is to talk a little bit about me, so let's get right into it. I grew up poor, black, and female. 3 strikes. I'm the daughter of a maid and a janitor. 5 strikes. But my parents, the maid and the janitor, taught me that if I work hard, play by the rules, and have the opportunity given to me by someone who had the power and authority to do that, then I could make it and I could live the American dream. They made it quite clear that opportunity was critical to success. Without it, success is impossible. You've heard I grew up in Jacksonville. I've been in Orlando about 31 years. I absolutely love Florida, in spite of Florida. But that's another panel, Paul. I'm going to wait. I love being a citizen in the United States of America. And believe me, I really do believe that America is the greatest, most powerful country in the world. But we live in a country where 1 in 4 children go to bed hungry every night. Now, somebody really should care about that. We live in a country where the working class, we're not talking about poor, lazy people. We're talking about people who are working 1, 2, 3 jobs to keep a roof over their head and food on the table and be able to afford the bare necessities. We live in a country where parents of those children are struggling every day to make ends meet. We live in a country where working people live below the poverty line. We live in a country where, yep, the rich are getting richer, and God bless them. I wish I could sit here and say that I'm rich. I'm not. God bless them. But the problem is not the rich getting richer. The problem is the poor getting poorer. So I want to thank you again for this awesome opportunity. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chief. As usual, I'm going to be rotating questions among our panel members, but I do encourage other panelists who have thoughts on the question to speak up afterward. And something tells me I won't have to do too much encouraging today. We'll all benefit from hearing multiple views. And we're going to take breaks periodically for questions from the audience. On each table, you'll find some index cards and some pens. Please feel free to write a question for one or more of our panelists and get the attention of our Sentinel employee back there, Nancy Tharp, so she can collect it. Daryl Owens, who is another member of our editorial board and a columnist, is stationed at the table back next to Nancy. He's going to be reviewing the questions and picking out a few to ask, and then joining the crowd to ask them. And he'll get many more than he can use, so he'll do the best he can to ask a representative sample. So let's get started. I'm going to start with Sean. Tico talked in his introduction about how complex a problem this is. If you had to identify a leading cause or perhaps two or three behind the growing gap between rich and poor, what would you name?
I think there are several factors at play here. Some have been sort of at work over time. The changing nature of our economy, the fact that it's become more globalized over time, I think that's put, stretched the boundaries of inequality in both directions, both at the top and at the bottom. I mean, for the wealthy and the successful, this creates a world full of opportunities, and you're able to sell iPhones or Facebook downloads globally. And so that allows successful individuals to really have a piece of a much larger market. It also puts pressure on workers because now we have to compete with workers around the world, and particularly those in the lower skilled areas who historically in the U.S. maybe were able to find jobs at higher wages, now see those jobs going overseas. I mean, basic manufacturing of transportable items doesn't occur in this country anymore, and those jobs aren't coming back. There was a time when you could get out of high school in this country, and my grandfather did that. He worked at a steel mill in Pittsburgh. He worked there his whole career. He retired with a gold watch and a fixed benefit pension. Those days are gone. So I think that globalization is playing a big part of it. And I think Tico touched on a point that I think is really important recently and also going forward is the policies that we've seen put into place, I think are only working to exacerbate this income gap. The zero interest rate policy of the Fed has caused a tremendous growth in wealth that I think is by and large captured by the top end of the income distribution. The other issue, for example, we're talking about part-time jobs and working multiple jobs. This is something that's going to be increasingly an issue, I think, because of the dichotomy in the Affordable Care Act between full-time and part-time employees. We have not seen that fully play itself out, but there's a real incentive in this law to shift away from full-time employees to part-time. And that is going to do nothing but worsen the issue of inequality.
Okay, so we've got a couple of causes: globalization, policies with unintended consequences. Stephanie, I'm curious whether or not you would add anything to that list, or whether you would concur.
I agree with globalization. I think there are a few other things. I think the primary cause is unprecedented special interest control of government at every single level, brought on by Koch brothers, ALEC, Citizens United. The income gap is their agenda. More money for shareholders, less for workers. Just like we saw here in Orange County on sick time. We saw who was running the government. We saw through TextGate who was pulling the strings and who didn't want any worker to have his sick time here in Orange County. I also think that closing the coverage gap is another important step to closing the income gap. Uninsured workers with no sick time is a recipe for lack of productivity and threat of job loss. Also, according to the Census Bureau, median family and median household incomes have been falling, adjusted by inflation, while the income of the wealthiest 1% has soared 31%. In fact, it's calculated that 95% of all economic gains since the recovery have gone to the top 1%. America has an emerging low-wage economy. While low-wage jobs like retail and restaurant were 22% of the jobs in the Great Recession, they now make up 44% of the new jobs added since then. We have folks with college degrees who are working in fast food because those are the jobs available. In fact, over 30% of fast food workers have received a college education. Orlando has it worse. Orlando has more fast food restaurants than any other city in the nation. These are the jobs that are hiring and expanding, and they are low-wage jobs. And it's reflected in our poverty numbers, when 35% of our community right here makes less than $25,000 a year. The fact that we are the lowest paid metropolitan area out of the top 50 MSAs in the country is a real problem. Additional causes, clearly increasing debt, lack of housing equity, how many people lost their homes with the Great Recession, corporate tax loopholes, and our failing education system.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. And before we move on to a different question, I just want to give the other three panelists the opportunity to weigh in on this question of the causes, some of the fundamental causes behind the income gap.
If I may, first I would agree with Stephanie that over the last 10 years, the problem of crony capitalism has accelerated dramatically under both the Bush and the Obama administration, where people that have the power and influence have lined up to create special considerations, bailouts, tax breaks, subsidies, you name it, that middle class and poor people simply can't afford to lobby for. So that is something that really has to be addressed, and it has not just been a Republican problem. Secondly, if we look at the social welfare state in the United States of America, Lyndon Johnson declared unconditional war on poverty in January of 1964. From January 1964 until January 2014, $20.7 trillion was spent of taxpayer money to try to win the war on poverty. 15% of the country was in poverty in 1964. 15% of the country is in poverty today. However, 6% of children in 1964 were born out of wedlock. The number is 41% today. Our social welfare network has had the perverse unintended consequence of destroying families. And if you look at the people that are most likely to be poor, it is single mothers in the United States of America. So our social welfare networks have played a tremendous role in creating that. And we have to address the school situation. If you're wealthy in the United States of America, you have school choice. I'm a middle-class guy. I have school choice. My children are homeschooled. If you are poor in the United States of America, you can go grocery shopping wherever you want. You can buy a cell phone wherever you want. You're able to buy clothes wherever you want. But in the United States of America, in the most important decision you may ever make in your life, where your children will go to school, you are largely told, this is your school down the street. This is the district where you live. We will do what we want to do in that schoolroom, and you have no choice. You can't move to a better district. You can't homeschool. You can't private school. I believe it is criminal what we have done to poor people in this country, telling them that you do not have the opportunity to gain the same educational choices that everybody else has. And that, in the long run, has to be addressed, or we will never deal with poverty in the United States of America.
Okay, I want to give the other two panelists.
I'd just like to make a comment about the school situation. You know, God bless families who can send their children to private school and engage in alternative school choices. That's wonderful. But we do know that the majority of tomorrow's workforce will come through the public school system. We do know that. And the amount of money that your family makes, or whether you have one or two parents in the household, should not determine the quality of education that you are able to get. And we also, when we look at poverty in America, I know the war on poverty was declared in the 60s, but we also have to look at the effects of long-term discrimination, generational poverty. You can't just wave a magic wand and say, okay, now laws have been passed, everybody starts out on a level playing field. It's just not going to happen. Education, we know how critical it is, but as I've said, it shouldn't matter what school you attend. If we have almost 200,000 children in the Orange County public school system, the quality of their education should not be determined by wealth or the lack of it.
Well, I guess we all agree on one thing, which is the educational system is a huge challenge. Look, two of the major predictors of economic success in this country are you from a single-parent home? Because that is a financial burden for that family and that challenge and that parent. And number two, did you finish or attend high school? In fact, we've got 1/3 of our minimum wage workers today either never attended high school or did not finish high school. So we've got to break down the traditional two-parent family, two-income family, two parents, folks who are involved in the lives of that child, and we've got a lot of young people not finishing and dropping out of school. And I appreciated Stephanie's statistics on Orlando, and they are stark. But we're talking about a macro nationwide problem here of out-of-wedlock births, destruction of the traditional family structure. I'm not moralizing or preaching. This is just an economic argument of two incomes supporting one family in one place and spending time with those children. And that's why we need to refocus, number one, our educational systems. And I'm all for educational choice, but we've also had this philosophy for years that every young person needs to go to college. They've got to be prepared to go to college. And you know what? There's a lot of great jobs out there for folks who don't go to college. We need to refocus on a lot of our technical training, our technical schools, and provide a lot of opportunities for young people who shouldn't or don't want to go to college and don't want to incur that student loan debt and want to just get out there and start working. And we have not done that well across the country. And we need to invest in a lot of our external programs that help our young people fill the void of not having that second parent in the household or not having that educated second parent in the household to drive goals. And we do that through community organizations like my Boy Scouts, which are driving brand new STEM programs across America and robotics competitions and things of that nature. Boys and Girls Clubs, the YMCA, where folks can get involved and volunteer. If we're not going to maintain that traditional family, that two-parent family who's going to engage and interact and push and ask those young children to set goals, then we've got to provide those infrastructure sources elsewhere, and we've got to focus on that pretty darn quickly.
Thanks. I am going to, before I direct this next question to Jack, I want to remind you all, if you want to submit a question yourself, take advantage of the cards and the pens at your table, and then get Nancy's attention. Jack, French economist Thomas Piketty has written a best-selling book, a worldwide bestseller, that argues that the concentration of wealth among the rich is a natural consequence of market capitalism. Do you agree?
If we define capitalism in the Adam Smith definition, yes, it is a natural outgrowth. People like Mark Zuckerberg, who figure things out before everyone else and then give us things we never knew were going to exist, the Henry Fords of the world, John D. Rockefeller, many of whom started out very poor. They weren't robber barons. The natural forces of capitalism, by definition, capitalism is allowing people to pursue their self-interest in a peaceful way where they do not kill or interrupt someone else's liberty or take their property, and be allowed to keep the fruits of their labor. That is Adam Smith capitalism, and to that extent, absolutely, he is right. You're always going to have some people figuring things out, making more money than everybody else. However, I've seen his book, I've seen his recommendation for marginal income tax rates of 80% to fix this. The president of France recently got a 75% income tax rate passed on millionaires. And look at the unemployment rate in France. Look at the number of young people that are now leaving the country as a result of this. The French president and this economist who is advocating policies like this is going to make matters even worse instead of addressing the issues of unnatural capitalism. And by that, capitalism's gotten a bad name because a lot of businesses have figured out how to game the system to get protections and money for themselves and stifle competition. And so to the extent that that's called capitalism, it's not capitalism, it is crony capitalism, it is, you could call it economic fascism, but to the extent we allow for natural capitalism to take place, where we all show up and go to work every day, yes, you're always going to end up with some people earning more than others. It's just a reality.
So is that a problem?
I don't see it, I don't see natural capitalism as a problem at all. In fact, one of the reasons why poor people in the United States of America are so much richer than poor people in other countries, many of them, if you are born poor, you're going to die poor because you have the wrong last name and no connections. At least in America, a lot of poor people making the right choices, pressing in, overcoming horrific barriers, can still climb up the economic ladder and be much better off than most of the people in the world. And that is because they can look up and say, wow, how did that person get that much money? What do I need to do to chase that amount too? That's a wonderful thing in my view.
Many of the one percenters certainly didn't press their way. They didn't work hard to get their money, they inherited it. And that's a whole nother story when we say the poor people can pull themselves up and work hard, where, yeah, we've got to work hard. Poor people do, because you have no other alternative but to work hard. But if you don't start out on a level playing field, if you don't have the access that we've just talked about, if you don't have that quality education, if the one parent that you have may be a drug addict and didn't come home last night, it's pretty difficult to say, well, you can pull yourself up if you're just willing to work hard and press your way through. Somebody has to level the playing field for hardworking people who don't have access and the power and ability to do it for themselves.
Sean, they're talking about social mobility, and you mentioned that in your introduction. I wonder if there are any measures of social mobility today versus how it compares with historical social mobility in the U.S. economy.
Yeah, there is. Beginning of this year, Raj Chetty, an economist, and some of his colleagues at Harvard put out a study that looked just at this phenomenon. And what they found was from 1970 to the present, the ability of people born in a certain quintile of income distribution to move up has not changed. And I think that's true. While all the issues that have been addressed here, I think, are correct, and yes, inequality has gotten much larger. The top is much further away from the bottom. But I still think that notion, that American dream, that ability, that opportunity to start in poverty and to finish your life somewhere well above that, I think, is something that continues to be a beacon to the rest of the world for people that want to come to this country. And you know, I have seen it. I've lived in developing countries, and I did grow up in poverty by our definition here. It's a lot different poverty in this country than it is in a developing country, believe that. And so I felt sorry for myself until I saw what true poverty was. And I also recognized, seeing the country from outside of its borders, you know, what an opportunity we offer to this world. And yes, there are problems and there are social issues that have to be overcome and addressed. But by and large, I can't think of another place that I'd want to be born if I was a low-income child with the hopes of improving my lot over my lifetime than the United States. I mean, I just don't see a better opportunity out there.
Let me add, Paul, I mean, that said, that does not, and I know Sean does not mean to minimize the challenges that we're facing, because there are some very difficult challenges, a lot of people that are having very difficult challenges. But case in point, Val talked about her growing up in Jacksonville, and she had the blessing of 2 parents. So you had 5 strikes, but you had a big plus on the other side, parents working with you. My parents came out of Cuba with nothing, shirt on their back. And I remember when I was a young child, I would talk to my father, and I would say, you know, are you mad at Fidel Castro? Because we had a great deal of money in Cuba. In fact, if you talk to people who leave Cuba, everybody was rich in Cuba, because Fidel took it from all of us. But we actually had some money in Cuba. So I used to talk to my father as a child, and I'd say, are you mad at Fidel for taking everything we had? And he said, I came to America rich. And I said, what do you mean rich? You had nothing, literally, shirt on your back. Literally, had to repass all of my father was a doctor, had to repass all of his medical certification, didn't speak English, came here speaking Spanish. They called him Dr. Tarzan because he would say, you, me, patient, go. I mean, so learned the language, became a citizen, did all of these things, moved to Sanford, Florida in 1962, saw a white waiting room and a black waiting room and said, I'm not doing this, merged the waiting rooms and lost every white patient he had. I mean, so we grew up in this same challenges. And when I asked him about that, he said, look, Fidel left me rich. He said, I have my education, I have my work ethic, and he couldn't take that away. It comes down to education. In this country, it comes down to education and work ethic, and we've got to find a way to enhance our education and target it towards those jobs that are going to exist in the future. The jobs that exist today, the problem with our economic system is we've chased off our manufacturing jobs, we've chased off those jobs that used to provide a stable middle class. So we've got a professional class and we've got an hourly wage class, and the twain are never going to meet unless we fix some of these educational problems, come up with new training programs, and get the government the heck out of small businesses' way so that we can change some of these regulations and start some small businesses in this country that can hire and employ people who want to work hard and who've got the education to do so.
Hey, I'm going to take a break from my questions and turn it over to Daryl for some of your questions.
Good afternoon. We have received a lot of wonderful questions, and I'm going to start with Professor Chambless with this one. In your introduction, you said Oprah pleases more people than you do in your class, that she makes more than you do. Using that formula, fast food workers should also make more than you. Because they feed more people than you touch per hour. And pleasing people, if pleasing people is your measure for income, how do you account for fast food workers making so little?
Well, first of all, I've eaten at some fast food places, and nobody's pleasing me at all in those places, okay?
With your capitalistic system, why do you keep going back?
Well, I go to Chick-fil-A. They're the one that I'm so happy with. The rest I don't. So to recapture this phrase, pleasing people, the term economists use, and you get in trouble when you start using terms economists use, so use the word pleasing, it's called the marginal revenue product of labor. See, that's better than, that's worse than saying pleasing. What that means is, it's the revenue a firm earns from each additional worker, okay? And the bottom line is this. As I said in my introductory statements, you cannot change the laws of supply and demand. It is impossible. Nothing we can do can affect that. Somebody working at McDonald's, there are 160 some odd million people in America's labor force in the United States of America. Probably 160 something million of them could make a hamburger. So somebody at McDonald's needs to understand that there's an enormous supply of labor that helps put downward pressure on how much they earn. At the same time, the demand for that specific individual's labor is not as great. So in effect, I actually please more people because if you look at the revenue college professors create for their colleges, there's a greater demand for a valuable college education than there is the frequent. But eating a Big Mac is not going to help you advance. An economics professor, a sociology professor, a mechanical engineering professor can. And to be fair, Dr. Snaith and I are rarer than a McDonald's worker because of the skill and education and training we've accumulated. Therefore, supply and demand intersects for us at a level that indicates we are doing more economically for society than someone making a hamburger, and that should encourage the person. In 1981, I worked for Kentucky Fried Chicken. And on Christmas Eve, when my hand slipped and went down in a vat of boiling grease, and I pulled it out saying things you shouldn't say on Christmas Eve or any other day, that was one more indication that I didn't want to be at Kentucky Fried Chicken at the age I'm at now. So I had to do something to make myself rare. I had to understand and come to grips with the laws of supply and demand. And now, fortunately, through those choices, I can. And that's the encouragement we need to be giving young people today and people who are struggling. If you don't like making 8, investigate what pays 10 Investigate what pays 20, and order your life in such a way to take advantage of that so that you can progress upward and gain more income over time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Here's another finger-looking good question. This one is directed to both economists. In Osceola County, there are families who are living in hotel rooms but who have jobs. Many of them are working full-time at theme parks such as Disney World. How is it good for our economy when these families, despite their employment, have to seek government help to survive? And I guess we can start with Dr. Snaith on this one.
Well, I think it goes back to some of the points that were just made. What is the ability of these workers to produce? And pleasing does sound better than marginal revenue product. I agree to the normal person's ear. That's the reason that their incomes are so low. And the notion, the discussion about the minimum wage and raising the minimum wage, I'm concerned a little bit about unintended consequences of trying to raise people's income through legislation. If it was that easy, why not pass a law that makes everyone a six-figure income earner? It's just not how it works. And it does work that way? I mean, I'll support that law if it works. Here's the thing. You raise the minimum wage, and for those people that are lucky to continue to be employed in their jobs and for the same number of hours, yes, their income is going to go up. But businesses will react. They will change how they produce goods and services when the relative price of those inputs change. And that means they're going to start to substitute away from labor. You go through a McDonald's, in the drive-thru, there's an automated machine that fills up the soda cups. If we push up minimum wage enough, don't you think that there'd be an automated machine that would flip the burgers or take the fries out of the deep fryer? It's nice to think that we could just do this by this simple act and make everyone better off, but that is not the reality of the markets, and you have to understand that there are potentially adverse consequences to this.
I want to jump.
One econ major.
Yeah, I want to jump in here because this dovetails with a question I had for Stephanie, which is,
I've got a lot to say on that.
yeah, given your leadership in the successful campaign to raise Florida's minimum wage and in the recently passed non-binding ballot initiative for earned sick time in Orange County, what do you say to folks who say that there could be some unintended negative consequences from these sorts of measures?
In every single place where the wages have been risen and where benefits have increased, the economy has expanded. If low-income folks make more money, it goes right back into the economy. Low-income people aren't putting their money overseas in Swiss bank accounts. It's going to the neighborhood, it's going to the store at the corner, it's going to groceries, it's going to rent. It's simple. Consumers with more money spend more money in businesses. On sick time, businesses have less turnover and their employees take fewer sick days and are more productive. For example, in Connecticut, the first state to ever pass earned sick time, employment has grown in those industries most associated with lack of sick time: hospitality, leisure, and health. Businesses are hiring more people in Connecticut. In addition, companies that at the time were very much against this, that were outspoken against having sick time for workers in Connecticut, have been interviewed since and are actually really kind of mad at the Chamber of Commerce for lying to them about what the effects were going to be. And now are in a place where they support these policies and are going across the country telling people that these have helped my own business and it's helped my state and my economy as well. So I think we have to be real about what the effects are. We're seeing it across the country. The one bit of growth in wages in the last year has been in the cities and states, I think 14 of which have raised the minimum wage in the past year. That's the only reason why we're seeing a little bit of increase in income in low-income communities. In addition, taxes. Half of all the fast food workers receive some sort of public assistance. That costs us $7 billion a year. Why is it that people who work hard for an honest day's pay for some of the most profitable companies in the world are paying their workers so little that it's being subsidized by taxpayers? What this is privatized profits and socialized costs. We all pay for McDonald's and Walmart paying so little. Also, when we don't have so much money going to the top, the middle class doesn't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going without taking on more debt. An economy so dependent on the spending of a few is prone to great booms and busts that we are all, again, affected by. And just today, in states like Florida, a new study out by Standard & Poor's talks about without income taxes, states like Florida, we are being drastically affected by the fact that nobody wants to spend money right now within the low-income communities because they don't have any to spend. And that affects our state budget at the end of the day.
So, I'm sorry, Tico. Go ahead.
I just want to chime in with a couple of quick thoughts on this, because I said in my opening remarks that I didn't think raising the minimum wage is a solution, but that there are solutions. Let's just apply some facts and some numbers to the conversation that we're talking about. And my numbers come from the Congressional Budget Office and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So
do mine.
I'm not making this up. 2.4% of the workers in America are in the minimum wage. 1/4 of them are teenagers. 1/2 of them are under the age of 25. 70% are under the age of 40. And 2/3 of them work part-time. I said at the beginning of my remarks, the challenge is A, the salary, okay, but B, the fact that we don't have full-time jobs for these workers to work in. In fact, the CBO says if you look at, forget about the minimum wage raised to $7 or $8, if you look at raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, it says 16.5 million Americans will get a raise, but only 19% of them today live below the federal poverty level. So the challenge is if we do this, what you're seeing is a lot of those minimum wage increases going to second and third incomes in a family, families which are making 2 and 3 times the poverty level, and we're not targeting where we need to target. There is a better solution. There is a better solution if you want to target the working poor, and that is one thing that both Democrats and Republicans agree on, and they can get together on it, which is increasing and expanding the earned income tax credit. That is a gift for workers who are working poor, who are working very hard, who are trying to advance themselves, and it targets that population specifically. It doesn't pick up the teenagers who want a nicer car or better clothes. Earned income tax credit expansion occurred in 2007 or 2009, and it expires in 2017. And that the expansion does. That's for families with more than 3 children. We need to get our Congress focused on increasing the earned income tax credit and continuing the expansion so that families with more than 3 kids or more than 2 kids can continue to get additional sources and help and funds. And this actually targets the working poor. This is not an argument about those teenagers who want to have a nicer car or anything else. This is a target marketed approach to focusing on those folks in need. And one last statistic, and then I'll pump back over. Again, this was not my numbers, Congressional Budget Office numbers. Took a look at the minimum wage increase to $10.10, and it said it would lift 900,000 people, workers, out of poverty at the cost of 500,000 jobs. That employers would respond by raising the pay of some and terminating others. To me, that's counterintuitive. That's a problem. Let's focus our targeted resources at where they need to be, which is the working poor, not everybody working minimum wage, 2/3 of whom are part-time, and let's really focus on solving this problem.
Tico, I have a report too from the Congressional Budget Office, so maybe they submitted 2 reports or 3 reports saying 2 different things.
It was the same one. They all.
It says the wage increase would help the economy today. Because as Stephanie stated, working people they're not going to invest their money in overseas bank. They're going to put it right back into the economy by purchasing food and other goods that they need right now. It also says that only 12% of low-wage workers will be teenagers. Only 12% will be teenagers. And that raising the minimum wage to $10.10 per hour will directly benefit 16.5 million workers.
Yeah, I said 16.9, but I said 16.5 as well, Val. But that same report that you're citing says raising that minimum wage will help 900,000 folks out of poverty and cost us 500,000 jobs.
But they still get raises.
500,000 jobs. So why would we not focus our efforts on the working poor instead of the 2/3 who are working part-time, or the group, the enormous group, more than 50% of whom are not in poverty. Focus the resources at the target. The target is the working poor. Let's create earned income tax credits. Let's make certain those families are taken care of and covered, and not focus on the minimum wage issue, which misses the target dramatically on the real working poor.
Do you believe that corporations that are seeing record profits should invest that money back into human capital, i.e. their frontline employees?
I think smart corporations take care of their income-producing folks. Absolutely they do. But I think there is also a value to labor, and a corporation's job is to take care of its shareholders. We don't like to hear it, but that's what they're created to do. I think it is our job as citizens to create support systems and mechanisms and to push our government to take care of these folks who are working hard, trying to get ahead by creating educational systems that work, that train them for jobs other than going to college, by pushing our elected officials to create earned income tax credits and support systems that give the people who are trying to get a leg up, and not push these costs onto what are essentially small businesses. You're basically saying the government isn't going to fix this problem. Small business, the government is going to say it's your problem to fix this problem that we created through overregulation, through barriers to entry into the business system, for the inability to get business licenses, for creating all sorts of regulatory structures that make it hard to start a small business. So yeah, I'm saying what we need to do is focus our resources towards the educational systems, prepare our young people and our folks who are returning to the workforce to work, and yes, put money in that earned income tax credit and let folks who are working poor, not everybody making the minimum wage, but working poor, let them stay focused, do their jobs, and get the tax credits back from the government.
Paul, can I add something here?
Sure.
I was in Williston, North Dakota over the summer, part of it on purpose because I wanted to do some research on the phenomenal changes in the economy up there. I met a young man who was bagging my groceries at a Walmart, and I asked him, by the way, would you mind letting me know what your starting pay was here at Walmart, one of the evil corporations that needs to be punished? And it was $17.10 an hour. And he said, if I were willing to work at night, it would be $19 per hour. Driving down the street to the Arby's, the young girl from Russia, would you mind telling me what your starting pay was? $15 per hour. Now, in case you're curious about what's going on, many of you know the tremendous oil boom in Williston has led to an amazing increase in the demand for labor up there. And with an increase in demand comes a natural, not government-created opportunity for an immigrant from Africa and Russia to move to this barren wasteland and earn far more than the $10.10 per hour. I would suggest, and Stephanie, with all due respect, there are some places where when the minimum wage goes up, if supply and demand intersects above the minimum, you're right, it does not destroy jobs. But there are plenty of studies that show in poorer areas where supply and demand intersects lower than the minimum, it does destroy jobs. Just recently, the city of Seattle, Washington raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and the Heartland Institute has reported that already companies are saying, we're not going there, we're leaving, we're going to the suburbs. So again, people struggle with this idea, if you raise it to 10, that we live in a vacuum and the businesses will do nothing but pay 10. And they'll be better customers. Well, businesses don't get to be rich by being stupid. If paying 10 made them better customers, which would ultimately lead more corporate profit, they would already pay them 10 or 12 or 15 or 20, because under the logic we're hearing here, the more money we pay workers, the better the economy will be. Corporations are greedy and they want profit. A better economy creates more profit, so they would do this naturally without the government. So if we look, I would say to organizations who care about the poor, buy them bus tickets to Williston, North Dakota. Help them go somewhere where they can make far more than the amount of money you're advocating force to create. Thank you.
Did you want to jump in?
I would like to add small businesses. There was a talk about that, about how raising wages on small businesses hurts them dramatically. In fact, most small businesses pay way more than the minimum wage. They also provide sick time. The people who are fighting the increase in minimum wage and sick time are not small businesses. In fact, most small businesses would like to see a level playing field because they're paying more. They're paying their folks $12 an hour, $15 an hour, giving them health insurance, and they're watching giant corporations like McDonald's and Walmart continue to pay poverty wages. The average pay for a McDonald's worker after working there for 4 years is less than $9 an hour.
Why not quit?
When do you, I mean, you got kids to feed, family?
I will say I've represented thousands of small businesses my last 30 years as an attorney, and they do pay more than minimum wage because they have 1 or 2 people who do the work of 2 or 3 people because it's a productivity issue. They invest in their training, they invest in their value, and they make certain that they deliver relationships with their clients and their products and in the quality of service they provide, and they pay them more because their utility to that company is very highly valued. And they might hire 4 people to do the work of 2 if those people weren't so good. But there is a productivity component that has to come into that conversation.
I wanted to ask you, Sean, whether or not your research shows that the income gap is a bigger problem in Florida or even in Central Florida compared with the rest of the nation.
Yeah, I think it is. I think the upper 1% has not seen the same gains in Florida that they've seen in the rest of the country, but the lower end of the income distribution, I think, has suffered more in Florida than is the case nationally. I mean, I think some of that is the structure of the economy. Obviously with the big base in leisure and hospitality, a lot of these jobs are lower wage jobs. And as a result, the income structure reflects that. We also have a lot of people that transplant in Florida from other places, retirees. Many of them, are bringing with them significant wealth, significant assets. So that tends to skew the distribution as well. It's a function of the economy and the availability of the jobs and the skills of the people to meet those jobs that I think ultimately determine what income distribution would be. I mean, Williston's not a barren wasteland. My daughter was born in North Dakota, but wonderful people, but it's been a remarkable transformation in that economy and the wealth and the jobs that were created. I mean, when I lived there in 2001, 2004, the joke was the last one out in North Dakota, please turn out the lights. And now the economy is booming and it's creating tremendous opportunity. And I think it reflects, what's happening in those particular markets.
I wanted to ask you, Val, since you began as a social worker and then were patrolling the streets of Orlando for nearly 3 decades, have you seen the economy or the plight of the working poor over that period of time get worse? Is it about the same? Is it any better?
I think one of the things that have been said already is we talked about the importance of education. And what I do know is 76% of the persons who are in U.S. prisons either do not have a high school education. They dropped out of high school. So if we know that, then maybe a good plan of action would be to make sure our children receive a quality education and they graduate at least high school. I would not say that it has gotten any worse. When I look at communities, I still see the same old problems. People who are undereducated, not educated, people who like job skills training, don't have jobs that will help them lift their families out of poverty. When we see crime-ridden communities, now let me say this. I believe there are some people who are just criminals. They just steal, they murder, they rob, they rape. They're just criminals. But what I also see when I look at crime-ridden communities is that crime is a byproduct of other social issues. Many I've already talked about, but then mental illness plays a major part. If you do not have the resources to afford treatment, to deal with some of the social ills that you are facing, then the problem just compounds itself. We've learned in the last couple of months about domestic violence, for example. It crosses all socioeconomic, all ethnic backgrounds. So does mental illness. So does some of the other problems. But if you don't have the resources, you don't have the access, then it just continues, as I talked about earlier, those generational cycles of poverty and problems. And that's what we, Paul, unfortunately continue to see.
It's a question for Tico. This summer, the Pew Research Center reported that the earnings gap between high-wage and low-wage workers was growing fastest among Hispanics. Are there strategies that you think would be especially effective for closing the gap among Hispanics?
Sure, and it's certainly no surprise because traditionally, in the old days, 15 years ago, if you were bilingual, and you had to be bilingual to get along in this community, you could, if nothing else, go sell timeshares and make a lot of money, right? I mean, you would get hired out to sell timeshares to the folks from Brazil and Venezuela and Argentina. One of the major challenges that I think we face as an Hispanic community is this desire today, number one, not to learn the language of English, which stuns me, right? I mean, if you're going to do business in America, if you're going to live in America, I think we need to preserve our culture. Believe me, Spanish is my first language. But it is imperative that if we want our young Latino people to be involved, to advance, to get through school, and to get meaningful employment anywhere they want to have it, they've got to learn the language. I don't think we need to mandate it. I mean, we don't need to mandate it. We don't need to say English is our language, nothing. Our parents, our Latino parents, need to impose upon their children the obligation to learn the language of business in the country in which they live. Because it makes it harder in schools, it makes it harder to advance, and it makes them socially non-promotable. We've got a problem there. And I want to just continue along this path. And I said if we want to have this real conversation, we need to have uncomfortable conversations to advance this dialogue. And I'll tell you, we have a problem in America today with boys. We have a problem with boys. I sat on the board of the UCF. I sat on the board of governors. Almost 60% of our college attendees today are women. Our jails are filled with boys. If you take a look at the suicide rate amongst children, boys are ahead. If you take a look at the mass crimes that are committed, it's our boys. Our boys have lost their way, they've lost their role models. And I'll argue part of it is because of a lot of the single parent families we've created. Another part of it is there is no place for them to try things and fail. There's no place for them to experiment and be boys. They grow up in a culture now that says you've got to be macho, you've got to be this, you've got to be that, and our role models are the idiots like Ray Rice instead of the folks that we really ought to be focusing on, which are our business and community leaders. So I think we need a huge initiative on our boys, on our young people, to teach them what it is to be a man and to be responsible. They're a lot of the problems that we're facing, and it's very, very troubling.
I would just like to add that young men of color are by far the first ones to be stopped on the police. And as we're seeing across the country today, again and again and again, they are being unfairly targeted, and illegally so in many ways. So I think it's important for us to focus on the boys, but I also think it's important for us to focus about what our police laws are and what's happening around this country right now.
And with that,
I was wondering if that was going to sit.
let's take a look at those high crime areas that I've talked about, those low-income, poverty-stricken areas. If 2/3 of African-American children live below the poverty line, and they're in those poor areas, and crime is a byproduct of social problems. You know, you've heard a lot about Ferguson. Blacks are being stopped more than whites. Well, if 67% of the people who live in Ferguson are African-American, chances are more blacks are going to be stopped than whites. But what we need to work for as we have this uncomfortable conversation is let's create programs that give children alternatives to juvenile delinquency. Whose fault is it? It's all of our faults. If we aren't helping somebody other than the people who live in our homes, then it's all of our faults. We can talk about 2-family homes all we want. And let me just say this. You know, I grew up in a 2-family home. My parents were married, but it's not that simple. It's about being able to afford, to be able to keep a roof over your head, food on the table, and providing the necessities for your children. That's where it boils down to. It's not my business whether you have a child out of wedlock or not out of wedlock. But it's really about, if we're really, as we talk about income equality, we have this conversation today in Winter Park at the Alphon Inn. Now, understand me, that's good because we need the conversation. But we could have had it in Pine Hills and had some people on the panel who are really the victims of it every day. Somebody has got, you know that saying that says, to whom much is given, much is required? I've lived my life by that standard. I've always worked harder for what I was paid. Are we working harder for what we are paid? Are we really making investments into people's lives who can't make investments for themselves? The poor aren't going anywhere, and we can say all day long, well, we're going to destroy jobs. Well, if you're working 2 jobs and your wage is so low that you can't even qualify for government benefits because they say you're making too much money, that's a problem. So if we're really seriously interested in making a difference, we've all got to step up. Education, we all can't send our children to private school. Everybody doesn't have 2 parents, so what are we going to do about it? Because your parent is a prostitute or a drug dealer, you don't deserve to be able to go to school and have the same opportunities as every other child? I think you do. And so if we're going to be serious about this discussion, we've all got to do more. We want to point the blame at education, or it's the corporations, and they have helped to create this problem. But we all have to step up and do more than we are required to do. How can you sleep knowing that 1 in 4 children go to bed hungry every night? And there's a lot of talk, criticism. We talk about partisan politics, about the president and what he's not doing in the Middle East. And we have critical problems that need addressing right here at home. Thank y'all. Right here.
Preach.
Jack, you had a...
I have been at Valencia for 23 years, and I've seen the West Campus change from one that used to look a lot like, it looked like Windermere, and now I have, the vast majority of my students are ethnic minorities. Many of them are from Pine Hills. And their faces light up, and their faces show discouragement on 2 issues. When I talk to them, when I talk to my classes about whether or not they had an opportunity, their parents had an opportunity to pick whatever public school they wanted, to have choice to say, I've heard Winter Park is better, I've heard Olympia is better, I want to take my children. There are movies out there, Waiting for Superman, if you haven't seen this, about desperate, every city where the issue of school choice comes up, it's largely minority families that demonstrate for the right to send their kids to whatever school, public school. We're not talking about private school and homeschooling now. We're talking about a system, a government calcified monopoly that tells the poor that the Supreme Court may have dealt with racial segregation in 1954, but now we have economic segregation of schools where if you are poor, you largely have no choice. You cannot drive your child across town and send them to the public school of your choice and give them a chance. A large portion of the kids who come to me from those families, when they realize that they were cheated and lied to and did not receive the same education as a public school kid did in a more affluent area, you can see the discouragement. You can also see the excitement. Every spring, I teach a seminar on how to start an eBay business. And it's almost all minority kids that show up because they are so excited by the idea of ownership, by the idea of being able to make money for themselves and have a better life for their family. They want to be entrepreneurs. But again, if you go back to, for example, the occupational licensing issue in the state of Florida, you have to have a license to be a cosmetologist, okay? And that can take $15,000, $16,000, $20,000 for the tuition and years of training. You have to have a license to be an interior designer, a license to be a barber. We are telling poor people, get this license, get this education, pass all these permits, and they don't have the money. Instead of getting out of the way of entrepreneurs in the poorest parts of our community and saying, what you're proposing, cutting hair, is not dangerous to the community, go do it, go try, see if it works. We are telling the poor that we are going to erect artificial government-created barriers first in their education, and then when they get out with a failed education, we don't even afford them the opportunity to get ahead in our own community because of all of the restrictions we place on poor people. And if we do not address that, and you're talking about caring for the poor people need to take to the streets to demand that the state of Florida set them free and allow them to get an education wherever they want. That is you'll never fix public education unless competition is imposed on this failing system.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here because Daryl's been waiting with some more questions from the audience.
Paul, can I just say one question, very brief? Why is one public school across town better than another public school? Why is that? We're talking about public school. I can see private, but why is one public school, the school of your choice, better than another public school? I'm done. Thank you.
The parents demand it. The parents demand
not
better
that simple.
education.
Okay, Daryl.
Well, I guess I'll switch my question up and piggyback off of what Val Demings spoke about. What are the panel's thoughts on students graduating with student loan debt and not finding the jobs to pay them off? The question being, how did their education help them get ahead?
Well, I tell you, I as I sat on the Board of Governors and the UCF's board for many years, I can tell you that it is a constant challenge. And I don't think that student loan debt in and of itself is a bad thing. I do think that the cost of education has gone through the roof dramatically, creating way too much student loan debt. I had lunch the other day with a young woman who I've watched grow up through college, and she just finished law school at FAMU, and she's waiting on her bar results. And I said, how's it going? And she says, well, I've got this student loan debt of $130,000. And I said, how can you have student loan debt of $130,000? You went to FAMU. It's like $17,000 a year. She said, well, I had to get my apartment, and I wanted to live downtown. So one of the challenges is we create a student loan system, and we studied this overwhelmingly on the Board of Governors. We created a student loan system where we now have our students who want to go to school, they sign the loans, they're really easy to pay later on, at least that's what it sounds like when you're a young person, and you decide, you know, I could live in that apartment instead of this apartment. And student loan now covers the car and the apartment and the living expenses instead of what a lot of us did, which was have a job. I mean, I got up at 6 a.m., I pumped gas at Phillips 66 in the morning, and I waited tables at night. I mean, that's what we did in those days because student loans were not readily available. So, number one, there's a challenge there. Number two, simply put, the cost of higher education has just gone through the roof across America. It's gone through the roof at our private institutions. I think if you look at the Florida State University system, we're still 49th in the country in tuition and fees. In fact, when we were looking at the tuition increases across the state of Florida, we realized we had to go up 15% per year for 5 years to get the top of the fourth quartile in costs for students. So higher education is still a bargain in Florida compared to other states. I think if you manage yourself, you can do that. But part of the problem is we have young people, we throw credit in their face, and we have a private system, particularly some of these private universities, the Everests and others who charge an incredible amount of money, and they do all the paperwork for you for the loan, and they basically say, look, don't worry about it, you don't have to pay it until later. And in our formative years, in our high schools, we don't teach our young people about budgeting and use of credit and credit cards and balancing your checkbook. Hell, we just want to get them to read and do some math. So when they come out and they're faced with those problems, I think it is an enormous challenge. So across the board, I don't think student loans are a bad thing. I think they're a great investment and they're a way to pay for your tuition. I do think that the escalating cost of higher ed and the amount of money that has to be taken out to pay for it, as well as what the proceeds of those loans are used for. It's way too much capital to be loaning folks to say, it's one thing to say, we're going to pay for your education and your housing and your books. It's another thing to say, go ahead and here's a bunch of money, pay for a new wardrobe and go out and go party and enjoy your college years on the dime of the next 40 years of your earnings. So I think we've got a lot of education to go on there.
Well, Tico, you touched on a question one of the audience members had about financial literacy, and why isn't Florida spending more effort to mandate financial education in our school systems? Is that part of the problem with the wealth gap and the income gap?
Look, there's no doubt that financial literacy is part of the problem, but I think it's crazy to think that in a lot of our middle schools and high schools where we're literally struggling to get kids to focus on reading and writing, that we can mandate that kind of an education. However, we should have a basic course there, but we also have amazing organizations that we can all be a part of. Junior Achievement that comes into those classrooms and helps work with that. Again, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, organizations which can help that process. This is going to have to be a team effort. We face incredible challenges, and our public schools face incredible challenges. I will tell you, I helped charter a charter school here in Orange County, which is a public school, called Workforce Advantage. We are only 11th and 12th grade. We take kids from all around Orange County. They get themselves to us. 8 hours a day, 2 days a week, they work on a job that we get them. The other 3 days, they're in class. 100% graduation rate, 100% job placement, or go to college rate when they're done. There are tools, there are programs out there, and you guys should actually cover Workforce Advantage because it's a very novel solution. You could write a big article about it, but you know there are
big picture of you.
There are tools and weapons that we can put in our quiver, but we have to do that. It's not as easy as mandating fiscal education and they're going to get it done. We've got to be engaged and involved with that. Val is right there. If we really want to solve this problem, we've got to engage in it.
Well, I would love to continue, but unfortunately we're approaching our 1:30 deadline when I promised you'd all be free to get on with the rest of your day. I'd like to say a special thank you to each of our panel members today for a good discussion. I'd also like to thank today's audience for joining us. We appreciate your attention and your provocative questions. Thanks to those of you who have been watching online. We hope today's event was like a Sean Snaith lecture, both interesting as well as informative. And you can look forward to learning more as the Sentinel continues our coverage of this issue. And I'm going to conclude with a plug for our editorial and op-ed pages. If you feel strongly about this or other issues, write us a letter or write us a guest column and send it to insight@orlandosentinel.com. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
It was.